Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Sharon Slavinsky here, who I have read for many years and met for the first time in person today. I think her book, Human Rights in Camera, to me is one of the key texts in visual politics and the key text on sort of human rights and photography. It's fantastic to have her here. She works on a range of different themes, including a book that's about to come out on dreaming.
Yeah.
So
trying to make dreams political objects.
Yeah. So she's always at the cutting edge of things, and she's been at the university that has just been renamed from the University of Western Ontario to Western University. You said, right?
Well, that's what they're trying to make us do now. Yeah.
So I'm not sure. Given that fact that we're so small, should we quickly go around and introduce ourselves so that you get a sense of who people are, and that might actually be good since we're in a manageable, though steadily growing group. Paul, you want to have a
Sure. I'm Paul. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Queensland. I'm looking at basically ontological security and how it relates to refugees from Syria. So,
I'm Tom O'Regan. I'm acting head of the School of Communication and Arts, and I'm part of the Visual Politics program in one of the sections that has recently had a seminar around basically media ethics issues, ethical issues of the visual image.
I'm just a master's student at Peace and Conflict Studies here at UQ, and curious mind, I can say, that's why I'm here.
I just got an email about this. So I'm
Hopefully you're in the right room.
I hope so. I'm doing my PhD in the Sustainable Minerals Institute. I'm interested in different ways of seeing space.
I'm Connie Dancombe. I'm a postdoc research fellow in Polsis, and I do work on social media, and I'm looking to integrate images into that at the moment.
Hey, I'm Jessica Reagan. I'm also from the School of International Relations, or International Studies, or what we're calling it now. I'm also the director of the Graduate Centre over there. Just interested.
I'm Catherine. I'm in the School of Communication and Arts. I'm doing an MPhil looking at how two Australian artists represent militarised technology, so drones and night vision capabilities in their paintings.
Hi, I'm Simone. I'm from the University of Copenhagen. I'm a PhD student and I'm visiting the University of Queensland at the moment, working with Roland and the Visual Politics Group, and I focus on visual politics and political violence, and particularly focusing on the Islamic State.
I'm Juliana Whitlock. I'm from Communication and Arts, and I'm doing a book called The Testimony of Things on Asylum Seeker Artifacts.
Wonderful. Good title.
Thank you.
Roland Pleiker, yes, most of you probably know me. I work on visual politics and trying to finish a book that's been hanging over my head for too long on the topic. And look, yes, you came in later.
I'm Miranda. I'm just a Master in Museum Studies student here. And also just curious.
So the usual format we usually had is 1 hour so that people can squeeze it into a busy semester, with the strict rule that people don't speak for more than 30 minutes so that we have enough time for questions. But since Sharon traveled, I don't know how many thousand of kilometers to get here. She was at a symposium in Perth, then flew to Sydney last night, and last night on to Brisbane, and here this morning back to Sydney tomorrow, and then back to Canada. So she came that long. I thought we'll do 1.5 hours, but we go as long as we feel is comfortable. He give us some opening remarks. We have a discussion. Then again, we can adjourn to St. Lucy's afterwards, and everyone is welcome to join us there if you want to continue the discussion afterwards. So, over to you. Thanks.
Well, I have a paper which maybe I'll read. It's not going to take. It'll probably be about half an hour. It'll probably be better than me trying to speak the paper off the cuff because it's fairly new work, and this is very much a kind of in-process project. I don't know where I am with it, to be honest, but the title comes from this Syrian group of, what they call themselves emergency filmmakers, actually. Abu Nadara is the title of the group, and they work anonymously. And they have been they produce a film a week, and they have been since 2011, the beginning of the crisis. There's like 300 or 400 titles now on their website. They have a lively Facebook and social media presence. every Friday afternoon they post a new film. But I'm not going to talk about Abu Nadara today, but the title of the talk comes from them, and they produced a position paper which they presented at the New School in New York about this question of the right to the image. And it was specifically, they've been fairly public about challenging the kinds of photographs of like Alan Kurdi washing up on the beach in Turkey. They see these kinds of photographs as undignified, and that somehow this is sort of furthering the kind of indignity that the Syrian people are suffering. So the kinds of film work that they're producing is really, really interesting, and it's about the kind of everyday lives of Syrians. Some of it is about people who are very traumatized, have gone through torture and whatnot, and are just sitting in a cafe talking about it. So there's one beautiful one about the smiters of Damascus, these men who are constantly beating silver into beautiful patterns, and the whole film is very rhythmic and beautiful to watch. There's tons and tons of them. Some of them are quite provocative. There's a kid that joins ISIS at one point. It's hard to know whether it's a stage thing or not. There's he looks like sort of a Charlie Chaplin off the streets kind of a kid, and then turns up to be an ISIS supporter by the end of the 3 minutes. It's quite intense. So, but after the book, which came out some time ago, I sort of wanted to think about how these kinds of images, the atrocity images, might be doing further damage. Not in the Susan Sontag kind of hand-wringing kind of way, but thinking then about this question of the right to the image and that Abu Nadara provoked in me. So I've been sort of playing with some ideas about it. And I just brought a couple of examples. I have sort of, as you all know, when you start to get obsessed about an idea, you become a hoarder and you end up with like 10,000 examples of the idea. But I just brought two examples of the idea today. But it starts with Eve Arnold's work. Eve Arnold's a Jewish-American photographer, and this is one of her cue cards that she used to kind of keep her ideas together. And I just love the question that she begins this cue card with, which is, what do you hang on the walls of your mind? And the cue card goes on to describe her game of solitaire, which she calls her game of solitaire, which is the way that as a novice photographer she assiduously collected her favorite images, which she then filed away in her imagination to bring them out in moments of stress and moments of quiet, she says. What were the pictures? Well, she mentions 3. George Rogers' photographs of Nuba wrestlers from the southern Sudan, quite famous photographs. This one made it into the Family of Man. You might have recognized it. Henri Cartier-Bresson's portrayal of children playing in the ruins of Seville in the early 1930s. And her fellow Magnum photographer Elliot Erwitt's series of dogs. He has a whole series of these kinds of photographs, usually dogs with their owners. In some ways, they're more portraits of the owners than they are of the dogs. But anyway, Eve Arnold's list seems suggestive towards a kind of pictorial ideal of humanity, it seems to me. Her own Family of Man, if you could think of it that way. A collection of photographs that aims to preserve an image of the dignity and diversity of human or non-human experience. One could certainly add, I think, some of Eve Arnold's own photographs to the list. I have filed away her School of Nonviolence series in my own imagination. I bring them out in times of quiet, in times of stress. They are a great reminder to me of the strength of fortitude of the civil rights era movement. This year is a training session for nonviolent protesters in Virginia in the early 60s. But it's Eve Arnold's questions that I'm most provoked by, and in particular that first abidingly open and expansive inquiry. What do you hang on the walls of your mind? Like a shutter that just won't close, the photographer's query calls attention to the gap between the photographs that we circulate in the name of human rights, or humanitarianism, or refugee rights, and the work that we hope that they can achieve in the collective social imaginary. More specifically, I think, Eve Arnold's question compels us to think about the distinction between pictures and images. A picture denotes an object with formal quality, something that can be hung on a wall or projected with light or printed in paper, whereas the term image, in contrast, suggests a mental representation, something that may or may not have a graphic corollary. We dream in images, of course, but for the most part, these customer experiences have no pictorial equivalent. This is an important point. In fact, the images that hang on the walls of the mind often have very little to do with material reality. You can think of stereotype. It's a very common way to talk about the world of psychic images, that stereotypes have very little to do with material reality. And as Freud frequently insisted, the imaginary world is governed by distortion. This is a distinction that seems significant for human rights too. The common definition of human rights as a set of moral principles that are enshrined in international and municipal law quietly relies upon an idea, which is to say a transcendent image of the human being as a creature who is in possession of an inherent dignity and certain inalienable rights. And in one way or another, human rights struggle, whether it be the 19th century anti-slavery crusades, the civil rights movement of the middle of the 20th century in the US, or contemporary indigenous struggles, I think all seek to claim this idea, which is, say, this image of the human being. And so when we're fighting for human rights, what we're fighting for, to borrow H.G. Wells' beautiful phrase, is at least in part, I think, a right to an image. And I guess the part of the wager of this project was to try to think about if it's more accurate, what it helps us to think about if we're thinking about visual politics, if people are in fact using pictures to fight for this image. But that there's a distinction here between this question of the picture and image, which gives us trouble. Okay, it might be easier to come at this question the other way around, which is, say, to focus on negative instances, occasions in which one is denied the right to an image. As any number of indigenous and anti-colonial scholars, or post-colonial scholars, for that matter, have taught us, colonialism can be understood as an imposition of an imperial imaginary. And carried within the colonial imaginary is a whole series of images. On one hand, colonial outposts like Canada, like Australia, served as cultural sites to preserve and extend the image of Western civilization. And on the other hand, of course, the process involves splitting off undesirable aspects of society and projecting them elsewhere. Europe managed to get rid of its own savagery by projecting it into its colonies, and in particular into the peoples of the colonies. And it, speaking of projection, there's a way in which American politics has made projection a sexy topic again. I mean, Trump, in some ways, you can think of Trump as his chief political practice is projection. He just takes things that are his own stuff. I mean, it was hilarious during the debate, the second to last rounds of debates where Trump was calling for drug testing. He wanted drug testing for the candidates. And I think it was Hillary Clinton's chief communications officer said, really? The person who sniffed his way through the first, I think he said snorted his way through the first debate wants a drug test? So there's a way in which Trump makes projection kind of an excellent political project. Anyway, the colonial population is then coaxed and cajoled into internalizing these negative images through a series of governance procedures, policies, everyday social interactions between citizens and non-citizens. And as a result, these colonial images, along with the structural relations with which they are entwined, come to be seen as more or less natural. There's a famous everyday example of this process in Black Skin, White Masks, in Fanon's important book. Fanon describes a brief encounter in that book with a white child who he encounters on a train in France. It's like early 1950s, maybe 1949 or so, in Lyon. And the child says to him, look, not says to him, the child says to his mother, actually, look, a Negro. Mama, see the Negro, I'm frightened. At first the encounter amuses Fanon. He sort of chuckles about it in the course of writing about it. But then he quickly realizes that he cannot escape this projection of his blackness, which is to say that he's trapped by the image of, as he puts it, ethnic characteristics battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, slave ships, and above all else, sure good eating. So what we might all too easily dismiss as the child's perception of him is in fact a projection, a psychological procedure which effectively seals Fanon into a crushing state of objecthood. He describes being fixed by the child's hail, the way a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. So the child imposes an image onto Fanon, or indeed a whole series of images, for which all of Fanon's extraordinary dexterity as a thinker and as a writer he has great difficulty repudiating. So, the struggle to assert and claim a place in humanity has always been a constant thread in human rights discourse. What happens if we frame these struggles as a claim to a right to an image? Which is to say, to bring forward the imaginary dimension as central to human rights claims. And as I said, as a way to explore this idea, I've begun assembling a series of scenes or photographic situations, if you will, which seem to exemplify this dynamic. And I only brought 2 of them with me today, but I'm happy to kind of share with you my list and add to the list if you have other ideas. I would love to hear them. Each of these scenes pose really interesting dilemmas to me, at least I think they're interesting dilemmas about the relationship between pictures and images. It seems one of the common ways that we attempt to claim a right to an image is through pictures. But here, as Eve Arnold's questions expose, there's a trouble there. Because there's an irreducible gap between the pictures that we circulate in the name of human rights and the images that hang on the walls of people's minds. Okay, so the first example, this is a Aesop's fable. It's my little inside joke, and I can explain it later, but it's really about Frederick Douglass. In an article published in the April 7th, 1849 edition of his abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, Frederick Douglass took aim at a smile. And here we were talking earlier about the politics of emotion, and I mentioned to Roland I was going to bring this question of emotion to talk about today. The offensive expression was not Frederick Douglass's, although it appeared on the surface of his face. His grievance was launched as part of a review of this book. He was excited to receive this book finally. He calls it this long-looked-for work, which was produced by a Quaker abolitionist, Wilson Armistead. In this volume in question, which was called A Tribute for the Negro, it spanned some 564 pages and included florid accounts of the evils of slavery, testimony from a great variety of sources on the moral, intellectual, and religious capacities of the colored portion of mankind, as well as numerous biographical, you can see there, biographical sketches and anecdotes. There was a discussion of Joseph Cinque, the leader of the slave revolt on the ship L'Amistad. Toussaint Louverture makes an appearance, as well as Douglass himself has got a little sketch inside this big book. Douglass's review of Armistead's book is ambivalent at best, and he recommends it as he says it as a most valuable work, but he also rails against a world that requires such a text, and here's just a piece of what he says about it. Here's a large volume made up of extracts from the sayings of authors, travelers, missionaries, sea captains, doctors, lawyers, and philosophers, and all to prove what? Simply that the present reviewer is a member of the human family not to be so regarded. If our dark cheek could reveal our feelings, words would be unnecessary to the beholder. So he's making an appeal to the politics of expression. What a fact to be handed down to coming generations that the Christian people of England and America have become so hardened by crime and blinded by prejudice that in the year 1849 they needed the light of a volume of nearly 600 pages to distinguish their brother from the beast in the field. Now, by 1849, Douglass was the best-selling author of the autobiography Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which was published in 1845, which is now widely acknowledged as one of the most important books in the history of the American anti-slavery movement. Many of his subsequent speeches were hailed as among the greatest oratory ever given. He was considered a more powerful and impressive speaker than Abraham Lincoln, with whom he advised frequently. He was also very masterful in the domain of visual literacy. An early enthusiast of photography, Douglass has been recently kinged the most photographed American of the 19th century. More portraits than Abraham Lincoln, more portraits than George Custer, more portraits than Red Cloud. There's been over 100. There's a beautiful book called Picturing Frederick Douglass that just came out, which has got, it's an incredible text in terms of it's got all of the photographs they've been able to track down, as well as the kind of subsequent life of those photographs. Here, this photograph, this is incredible. This is one of the earliest portraits we have. This is a daguerreotype, and it's a full plate daguerreotype. This is a guy who just literally fought his way out of slavery and is starting to amass portraits of himself. And this would be expensive for someone who just fought his way out of slavery to get a full plate daguerreotype. This is an incredible, much written about photograph. There's something quite spectacular about his appearance. You can see he's got a very dignified way of presenting himself to the camera. And he was certainly careful about his visual images, just as he was with his words. Even a cursory survey of his enormous catalog of portraits provides the unmistakable evidence that he was self-reflexively engaged in constructing his own image. The portraits show the reformer's nuanced grasp of the politics of the face, to cite Jenny Etkin's beautiful book, or more accurately, perhaps, the politics of expression. Among his more than 160 portraits, only 3 show him smiling, one of which is his wedding portrait. The others come from the very last years of his life. Throughout his life, Douglass was conspicuously adopted what might be called the dignified expression, which is to say his portraits served as a kind of visual claim of his human status, or to be more precise, his visual politics not only demanded inclusion in the human family, to use the terms of the Universal Declaration, a claiming of his supposedly inalienable rights as a human being, but I think more specifically we can talk about this as a kind of claim to assert his human dignity. And Douglas taught us that the face is a very particularly potent site to make such political claims. And I think it's interesting to sort of see when this, as I'm sure you all know, this concept of human dignity has now become super important in human rights discourse. It's like the key term that sort of circulates amongst all of the kind of various UN documents. But it's not there in the early sort of antecedents to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You don't find the term dignity in the American Declaration of Independence, and you don't find it in the French Declaration of Rights of Man. It's not a term that's used. It's a term that kind of comes to the fore by the 1948 Universal Declaration, and then sort of you find it almost in every single rights claim after the fact. But I think you can see Douglas making a kind of claim for his dignity visually before this. Given his sensitivity to the aesthetics of human rights, it might be no surprise that Douglas's review of Armistead's volume takes special aim at the book's so-called superior portraits and engravings. In his opening remarks to that review that I mentioned, he flatly states that Armistead's book would have been better off without these pictures. To be clear, Douglas is taking aim at the engravings. Here's one. This is the engraving from Armistead's book. There's about 5 or 6 of them. This is the engraving of Cinque. And this would be, because it's at the time it's published, the half-tone process has not come into yet. It takes another 40 years for that. So you can't, though you can have, of course, daguerreotypes, you can't circulate them in a mass-produced way. So you'd often have these engravers who would cut engravings from other kinds. This isn't cut from a very famous painting, portrait painting of Cinque. And here is the engraving of Frederick Douglass. I don't know if I have a, no I don't. I don't have a close-up of, you can just see that they've given him a smile. And he is so mad that I'm sorry, it's not a very clear picture, but it's because the book was so old that it must have gotten humid and then the pages stuck together. So I literally had to like almost cut the pages together to get the engraving out. But Douglas is obviously taking aim at Armistead's book's failure to capture a likeness of him. But more significantly, I think he takes issue with the gap here between pictures and images, the images that hang on the walls of people's mind. I'm going to give you his remarks. I have 2 slides to give you a sort of full sense of what Douglas is furious about, because I just think it's so amazing to me, this particular quotation. So he says, okay, the engraving of brave Cinque falls far short of expressing the bold and majestic bearing of this heroic son of the forest. Of course, Douglas met Cinque, so he knows what he looks like. That of Frederick Douglass we shall leave it to others to criticize, begging only to remark that it has much more kindly and amiable expression than is generally thought to characterize the face of a fugitive slave. So you can see here's where he's pissed that he's smiling. Never having seen the other persons to whom the additional portraits are designed to represent, we say nothing of them, but hope they are a truer likeness than either that of Pennington, Cinque, or Douglas. Before quitting the pictures, we shall venture one remark which we've never heard expressed before, and which will perhaps be set down to the account of our Negro vanity. And it may be, not unjustly so, but we have presented it for what it may be worth. It is this: Negroes can never have impartial portraits at the hand of white artists. It seems to us next to impossible for white men to take a likeness of black men without most grossly exaggerating their distinctive features. And the reason is obvious. Artists, like all other white persons, have adopted a theory respecting the distinctive features of Negro physiognomy. We have heard many white persons say that Negroes look all alike, and that they should not distinguish between the old and the young. They associate with the Negro face high cheekbones, distended nostril, depressed nose, thick lips, and retreating foreheads. This theory, impressed strongly upon the mind of an artist, exercises a powerful influence over his pencil, and very naturally leads him to distort and exaggerate those particularities, even when they are scarcely exist in the original. The temptation to make the likeness of the Negro, rather than of the man, is very strong, and often leads the artist as well as the player to overstep the modesty of nature. There is the greatest variety of form and feature among us, and there is seldom one face to be found which has all the features usually attributed to the Negro. And I think with the way he's describing this idea of the Negro is the kind of image that people have in their minds, as opposed to what he hopes photographs will portray. Okay, blah, 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 color means I am black but calmly. In other words, I'm black and beautiful. The saying of the 70s is sort of here in Douglas. Is as true now as it was in the days of Solomon. Perhaps we should not be more impartial than our white brothers should we attempt to picture them. We should be as likely to get their lips too thin, their noses too sharp and pinched up, their cheeks too lantern-like, their hair too lank and lifeless, and their faces altogether too cadaverous. But we must let the picture go and console ourselves as Thomas Whitson once did when he told us that he should become handsome if public opinion ever changed. For our part, we like a large nose, whether it be flat or sharp, no matter which, so the metal is there, everyone to his taste, so he does not trample on human rights. It's also just like a great Beyonce moment. It's like a formation, I like my nose. I like my Negro nose with Jackson 5 nostrils. It's a great line, but there it is, 150 years earlier. Okay, so Armistead's engravings of the abolitionists was cut from the frontispiece of the first British edition of Douglas's narrative, the so-called Dublin edition. And the author disliked the image and complained about it to his own publisher in 1846. He wasn't alone. Others disliked it too. When sending a copy of the narrative to a friend, Charles Dickens wrote, "There was such a hideous and abominable portrait of the author in the book that I've torn it out, fearing it might set you by anticipation against the narrative." So the picture, we might say, did an injustice to Douglas's right to an image. Or perhaps more accurately, the picture failed to do justice to Douglas's right to a dignified image, which is to say it lacked the appropriate level of gravitas for a man who had to fight his way to freedom. This question of dignity is interesting, as I said, to human rights discourse. And through his unparalleled brand of visual politics, Frederick Douglass teaches us that dignity lies at the border between the body and the imaginary plane. It is both an embodied sensibility and a property of belonging to our shared gaze. To be human seems to involve claiming a right to a dignified image, to see and to be seen to exist. And since its invention, photography served as one of our most important tools in this crucial political exercise. Okay, so here's the other example, which I picked partly because it's also about face politics, but it's a much more contemporary example, and it's trying to think about this. Okay, so if Douglas was trying to fight for his right to an image using photographs and complaining about other kinds of pictures, I was trying to think about now how might this function on a community scale or on a social scale? Can pictures serve as a medium for a community to claim the right to an image? And how does it change when we're talking about mass psychology? Okay, so in 2011, the TED Foundation awarded its highest honor to this guy. It's a prize of $100,000, and it was given to the French artist who goes by the name of J.R. I think he's fairly anonymous. I mean, I'm sure people know who he is. He's not exactly hiding his identity, but as far as I know, he just goes by the name J.R. He got his start as a graffiti artist as a 15-year-old, but he made his name by illegally pasting photographic portraits of young people from the housing projects around Paris in the bourgeois parts of the city. Here, this is part of his Portraits of a Generation series, and they started making the nightly news in 2003 after the riots broke out in the suburbs of Paris when those two or three kids who were being chased by the police, they ran into a power station and were killed, and it kind of aroused a set of riots. And as J.R. puts it, this is the moment that he realized the power of paper and glue. He took his photographeur method, as he calls it, around the world in the Middle East. He took portraits of Israelis and Palestinians and pasted them up on both sides of the wall, the so-called apartheid wall, challenging people to tell them apart. In Moro, Brazil, he organized one of the poorest favelas to paste giant images of the women who'd lost their sons to gang violence on the sides of their homes. This is in, I can't remember the name of the favela, but it's one of the most poorest places. And the Brazilian media went wild with speculation about these eyes that started appearing in the hills over Rio. For his TED Prize, J.R. launched the Inside Out project, and this is what I want to focus on. This global art project, which as he puts it, involves passing the process. The rules of the project are simple. The public is encouraged to gather at least 5 participants together for what he calls a group action. They have to write a statement about their cause or a message, and they take portraits of at least 5 individuals. People send the portrait, their the digital files to JR, and he will send back these giant 4x5 foot posters of their portraits, black and white posters, which then participants are encouraged to kind of paste up. I have pulled this for another talk, but you can see that there are several projects all around. I pulled this up because I was in Perth, but if you look on his website, you can pull up all the various actions, some of which have happened around here. Looks like there's one in Brisbane, actually. The response was overwhelming, apparently, when he launched this project. To date, here you can see that at the top, this was just a couple of days ago when I pulled it, over 260,000 portraits have been produced by JR Studio, over 1,300 group actions in 129 different countries. It's probably the largest public art project in the world. And I brought two videos of this project. The first one's just about a minute long. You can get a sense of the various things people have done with JR's project.
Inside Out a continué de grandir. On a ouvert une imprimerie à New York.
Hola, equipo Inside Out. De una zona de un barrio que tiene una historia de violencia muy pesada. Algunas fotos, personas que siempre habían trabajado dentro de la legalidad en el barrio, que era prevenir el reclutamiento de jóvenes a los grupos armados que tenían como modelo.
The Inside Out project is all about visibility, and the Pride movement, visibility is everything.
For me, I think it's strange how frequently we avoid eye contact.
Il y a une loi qui interdit la fabrication d'abris en fait, et qui autorise les forces de l'ordre à détruire sous 48 heures et sans l'autorisation d'un juge. Du coup, l'idée c'était de trouver une loi qui pouvait nous protéger. Et on a pensé au vide juridique qu'il y avait autour de la protection de l'œuvre d'art. Donc l'idée c'était de recréer des abris, œuvres d'art, qui seraient donc protégées de la destruction.
I love that. What a smart young people that they found a loophole in the law to protect the shelters they're building. Okay, Inside Out is probably paradigmatic of this new genre in art that's sometimes called participatory art, or if you're there's all the art historians are fighting about what to call it. Sometimes they call it relational aesthetics, and then they get into fights about it. It has very many names, but it's a kind of art project that emerged in the late 1990s, maybe early 1990s, and the work has several characteristics. Involves an audience as the main focus of the work, often a mass audience. Here in this case, JR is all over the world. It has a desire to erode the distinction between institutional and social space. It's not about putting things up in art galleries, it's about public space. And I would say a breakdown of the traditional distinction between artist and viewer, and JR is really big about this. He's constantly talking about it. It's not his project, it's everyone else's project. Okay, so I just wanted to focus on, I have one long sort of piece of video, it's about 7 minutes long, and I don't know, I'm vexed by this, this particular instance. And to me, on one hand, it opens up so many more questions for me about this question of the right to an image. And it's set in Tunisia. So one of the first groups that took JR up on his proposal for the Inside Out project was this group in Tunisia, a group of local photographers and activists. And I'm sure, as you know, 2011 was a pretty kind of a tumultuous year in Tunisia. The revolution had begun in December, I think, 2010, and so it was within a few weeks, still, things were massively in transition when they started this project. And as you'll see, that JR feels compelled to visit them. There are certain projects he says that he feels the need to witness. And so here's the 7-minute clip, and then I think maybe we can just talk about it. I have a few ideas about it, but I just still don't know what to think.
Il y a des projets que j'ai envie d'aller voir par moi-même. Il faut que je sois témoin d'une telle expérience.
Salut, enchanté GR. Bonsoir. Vas-y, c'est ça. Enchanté. J'ai ramené plein de photos en plus. Là, c'est une partie, mais là-dedans, il y en a déjà 4 ou 500. Ouais, c'est 500. On les a imprimés des fois 3-4 fois chacun et tout. Donc comme ça, on peut les remettre à plein d'endroits différents. C'est parfait, c'est super. On essaie de mettre une règle pour le projet, que ce soit des portraits, et qu'il y ait quelque chose qui se dégage. Et là, on l'avait dans tous les portraits, il y avait à chaque fois un rire. C'est une sœur? Et là, ça c'est la taille de l'affiche politique qu'on placarde.
Je leur disais, ça suffit, on a toujours eu des présidents sur nos murs, maintenant on va voir les Tunisiens, quoi, et les Tunisiennes. Ils étaient super fiers de pouvoir apparaître là où le président était, quoi, tu vois.
Prendre la place.
Et justement, cet endroit où avant il y avait le portrait d'Ben Ali, il y en a plein d'autres comme ça sur le chemin. Ça, je trouve ça fort parce qu'en fait, lui, il avait chopé les meilleurs endroits quand il pense. Et au moins, il nous a facilité le boulot sur un truc, c'est le repérage des murs, quoi. Et en plus, les gens ont déjà découpé sa photo pour nous laisser coller, donc c'est parfait, quoi. Il y a eu un timing, préparation, je sais pas comment vous avez fait, mais c'est super bien préparé, quoi.
Je suis vraiment très reconnaissant à ceux qui ont chapeauté cette expérience. C'est formidable que le Tunisien puisse se retrouver à travers ces photos-là. C'est toutes les catégories sociales qui sont représentées. Là, on se retrouve, là, on est Tunisien.
Regardez ça. Comme ça.
Je voulais rentrer à la maison aujourd'hui bourré de colle. Et quand ils vont me poser la question, qu'est-ce que vous étiez en train de faire? Je vais leur répondre, j'étais en train de faire quelque chose pour mon peuple.
Qui aurait pu croire qu'un jour on pourra toucher à ces murs? Aucun ne le croyait. Mais pourtant, on est en train de le faire. Et avec un grand amour aussi. Mais il reste aussi beaucoup de murs. C'est pas la fin. Ça ne fait que commencer. Et on finira par vaincre, par gagner. C'est ça le destin de la dictature, c'est ça.
Mais qui sont ces gens-là? Ils font une campagne électorale, ce sont des martyrs, ce sont... C'est quoi?
C'est impossible, c'est un patrimoine culturel, c'est impossible. C'est pas normal. Il faut mettre sur un mur ordinaire, mais pas sur ce mur-là.
C'est une agression.
C'est pas.
Fallait pas y toucher.
Non,
ne mettez pas sur nos murs. Il nous appartient ce mur. Nous sommes à 2 mois de la Révolution et déjà, certains, dans l'ombre, ils sortent et ils veulent nous imposer des images et des schémas.
علم تونس هذا هو علم تونس هذا شعبنا حط خريطة تونس حط علم تونس ليه
Mais pourquoi vous agissez de la sorte? Allez, on fait ce choix. Allez dans une galerie d'art.
So, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say about the sequence. It's so compelling to me and vexing in terms of these kinds of questions about visual politics. On one hand, I think that group action can be read as an exemplar of the people's right to claim their own image. On the other hand, I think it's amazing to me that JR's work has almost completely escaped criticism. There's no one that has touched it as with a critical hand yet. I mean, on the other hand, I think we can certainly read the way in which, Tunisia is, of course, a French colony from 1881 to 1957, so there's a way in which you still have the kind of hand of French rule kind of coming in here, and in particular the way JR kind of comes in as a sort of subtle director to the project. I think it's also, I think it's so fascinating to think about the way in which they tried to sort of people the various spaces where Ben Ali's portraits, in Tunisia, the only public portraits that were allowed to be posted would have been of the president prior to this. And there's a way in which they tried to you can see just the tatters of the original political portrait there. That's so interesting. And there has the only way I've been able to think about it so far is to kind of think about the visual antecedents to it. And there's certainly, of course, here in the famous frontispiece, the Leviathan, the way in which you have the kind of body of the sovereign is composed of all of his citizens here, and there's a way in which you already have this kind of visual politics, at least in the Hobbesian sense of sovereignty functioning there. And I was trying to think about, there's a way in which in Hobbesian sovereignty we have to kind of give up our own will and agency in order to be governed by the so-called benevolent sovereign as a way to kind of stave off the war each against all. And it's interesting in a way to read Hobbesian versions of sovereignty in the context of Middle Eastern politics now, where there is sort of ongoing sectarian violence. I'm not trying to make a case for a return of Hobbesian sovereignty, but it's interesting. And in terms of the kind of pictorial specifics of it, here you have all the subjects facing the sovereign, giving their allegiance over to the sovereign, whereas in JR's projects, they're of course all faced outwards. There's a way in which much of the discussions about the Leviathan focus on the fact that everyone's facing the sovereign, although my colleague Mark Reinhardt has this beautiful essay on the fact that not all, there's the few faces that are turned back, even in the Leviathan frontispiece itself, as if there's a kind of seed of dissent in the image. But I don't know, I don't know what to make of it. I think it's fascinating to think about whether or not how people might claim a right to their own image. Is this just what democracy looks like? People acting, badly, tearing things up all the time, fighting with each other? Is JR's project only a promise to reproduce the very configurations of colonialist, racist, patriarchal state power that human rights movements are seeking to transcend? I don't know. I mean, I don't have any answers except that it's interesting to think about how pictures give us such trouble to our attempts to claim the right to an image. Yeah, maybe we can just have a discussion now.
Thank you so much for a fascinating journey that you've taken us on, and we've got plenty of time for discussion, comments.